In 2019, virtually countless cities, counties, and states filed lawsuits against major drug companies, a sociopolitical trend with no sign of slowing down. The basis for these lawsuits, according to their many plaintiffs, is twofold. One, drug companies are responsible for our nation's drug death epidemic and they deserve to be held accountable. And two, the money awarded from drug companies to cities, counties, and states will be used to fund further community efforts to combat addiction in those respective areas. Today's guest believes that while the sentiment behind these premises may be perfectly good, they are ultimately illogical and bound to fall short of success, or worse. Her name is Dr. Terri A. Lewis. Dr. Lewis is a healthcare consultant helping people solve or even wrap their minds around major systemic problems that cannot be fixed through only one solution, and to which certainly no simple solutions exist. These problems are called wicked problems, and Terri Lewis believes that our nation's addiction and drug death issues are both facets of a major nationwide wicked problem. In part 2 of this interview, Terri Lewis explains that filing lawsuits against pharmaceutical industries are attempts to solve a wicked problem with a single simple solution and under a false set of assumptions. She expresses concern that while we believe that we're making headway in solving a major problem, we may actually be headed in exactly the wrong direction, and perhaps even fueling the problem rather than fixing it. But that's part 2. Part 1 is broader. Before addressing that problem specifically, Terri spent some time educating me and listeners about the nature of wicked problems and ways of solving said problems using systems thinking. So this part 1 is a crash course in systems thinking, and that's what you'll hear today. So stay tuned for next week for part 2 of the discussion, where Terri and I will talk about some of the major issues underlying this modish trend of attacking drug companies for our problem. And we'll also offer an alternative way to conceptualize addiction and drug death problems, and even suggest ways to operationalize a systems-oriented approach to solving them. For today, again, you'll hear Dr. Terri Lewis explain systems thinking and wicked problems in a way that we can understand them, and we'll use the knowledge that we gain from today's talk and apply that to part 2 of the conversation, which you'll hear next week. For now, enjoy part 1 of this 2-part discussion with Dr. Terri A. Lewis. Here with Dr. Terri Lewis. Terri, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm happy to be here.
So would you mind talking a bit about your background, and maybe you could offer listeners a window into a few of the major things that keep you busy each day?
Well, I am a clinical educator. I work primarily within the fields of rehabilitation practice and mental health. However, that's a large umbrella, and it encompasses a lot of social science and community systems work. I have always worked in the area of kind of the T2 error. That is, we fund systems of care, but we don't pay attention to the contextual factors in which we deliver care. So I have found a home in that area in terms of designing communities and designing systems of care and care delivery that are very focused on systems approaches. And that's how I came to this conversation. We purport to spend a lot of money and distribute a lot of services to a lot of people, but we have a lot of issues with that. And one of the large issues we have is that we spend a lot of money and we spend it repeatedly, but it often fails. And we don't understand why our efforts fail to execute properly. So that is an area that I really like to work in. I teach that. I train administrators, but I also train clinical folks who are going to have to manage those issues. So I learned over time that by reteaching how we think about what we're doing in terms of systems approaches, that we get people who are much more satisfied with their work. We get honest deliverables, and we have a lot more control over what we're doing, how how the people we work with interact with the system, and how effective our approaches are. I've always said that our first product for whatever we're doing is people, and people operate within systems that we often don't fully understand. So I think it's a pretty good marriage of ideas.
So before we get into the substance of this particular conversation, I just want to offer an endorsement of the skills and the kind of thinking that you've just mentioned about yourself, and add that you're an expert within the domain of health and rehabilitation, but you have a unique ability to understand systems in a way that transcends academic boundaries. I think that I and many other professionals regularly are asking you for advice about systems of education, care, mental health, physical health, business, and you're a clear-minded and helpful critical thinker across domains. So with that out in the open, I just want to explore two major themes today using that skill set, and I think that you are in an ideal position to help me and help listeners gain an understanding of both of the topics. Litigation, lawsuits against pharmaceutical industries is going to be the main feature of our conversation. So if people don't know, in the last few months, seemingly countless civil suits have been opened by many U.S. states against various large pharmaceutical companies, and the basis for these lawsuits follows sort of a standard story that there is a nationwide opioid crisis. That opioid crisis means that pharmaceutical industries flooded the country with opioids, and then those opioids made people addicted to them, and it killed many others, and now there's been irreparable damage done to our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones, people in our community, and none of this would have happened if not for Big Pharma. And this story kind of gives us our bad guys, our villains, and these drug-pushing villains also have a lot of money. So the idea is nice here. By filing all of these lawsuits against these very rich and very evil companies, we'll be serving justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, states can take the money earned from the lawsuits and spend it on helping resources for people who have been adversely affected by drug addiction and drug death.
All of that would be absolutely wonderful if it were true.
Yeah, it sounds
but
nice
it's
and it's well
true.
packaged, but right, it has that truth problem.
Right. It's not. It really lacks truthiness, and there are a lot of reasons for that.
Well, I should say, we would probably agree that there's some truth to some of the claims made within that frame. I mean, that some of those things are superficially true. The narrative itself is largely false. And we could even talk about the perfectly good reasons for hating pharma, the perfectly compassionate, perhaps moral reasons for wanting money from them to put into a system of care. But you and I are going to explore some more critical questions and, what are the expected consequences from this litigation? Who is involved in the process? Who wins? Who loses? Who's being helped? Who has a voice? An ability to speak on his or her own behalf. And then, just to put it bluntly, is it possible that this grand plan, which probably comes from a place of good and compassion, could potentially harm the very people that it's intended to help? So I guess that's a leading question, but I guess I'm just trying to be honest that that's where we're going with this. I think in order to have a coherent discussion about all of this in a way that we, as well as our listeners, are going to be on an equal playing field, we decided to elevate the conversation to sort of a meta level. So we're going to think about thinking. And more specifically, you're going to help me and help listeners understand how and why and when systems fail, and even how to conceive of such a thing when we're in the trenches. So part one of this talk is a discussion about systems thinking, which you'll provide us all with a 101 course in, hopefully. And part two of the talk will be a discussion in which we apply all of that to the way that we think about these lawsuits against drug manufacturers, and we can come to some determinations about whether we're helping or hurting, and if hurting, then what to do about it.
I think that's an ambitious line of conversation, but I think it's also rich with opportunities to converse and explore some ideas. So I think we should dive into it.
So let's talk about systems in general, and it might be wise to let you direct this area of the conversation. Now that people have a better understanding of what we want to accomplish Could you just describe again in a potted way how you came to know so much about or just reiterate how you came to know so much about systems and how you've applied this knowledge at a practical level?
Well, I was really, really fortunate early in my career, in my work life, to have the opportunity to learn to do community design work. That is not something that I thought that I would find myself doing. And I had very, very little instruction or training in the ideas involving how to do that. But I was really fortunate in that I was tapped to be involved as a system engineer, so to speak, for educational systems after the passage of the Rehab Act in 1972, 1973. And it seems a long time ago, and it was, in the span of things. But what that involved was actually nationwide, we were embracing the idea that people with disabilities should have the opportunity to participate in their community. The problem with that was that we did not have resources in the community that were equipped to embrace that idea. We didn't have systems, laws, rules, and programs, people trained to take that job on. So my responsibility became that evaluating across systems of education how to create a system from the bottom up, from babies into adulthood, that could embrace and facilitate serving and educating people at the level of their local community all the way up into adulthood.
So you're up for ambitious tasks.
Well, I didn't know how ambitious it was going to be at the time. Okay, it's really one of those things you kind of fall into naively, and yeah, it sounds like a great idea. Let's go for it. I'm kind of a curious person, and I like working in the gaps. So it's the kind of work that I have found very fulfilling, and I have learned a tremendous amount. So over the years, my job has been to design systems of care and to work closely with communities and community organizations and community individuals to create a model and to work toward fitting that model, and to fit that model that represents characteristics of actual communities. So, in this country, we talk a lot about urban versus rural and, economic shifts, and we've had waves and waves of that over the years. We're undergoing another one right now. So what we have to do is to understand that communities actually are living organisms that have behavior. And that's how I fell into working with systems and systems theory, is you have to find a construct that kind of helps you to manage what you're doing. And systems theory works really well. Systems have elements, they have boundaries, they have characteristics, they have sub-elements that are unique to their locations and their resources, and they're pretty value free. They're not good or they're not bad. They are what they are. And how you work with these elements and sub-elements from not only a resource management but a behavioral approach is really a great opportunity to integrate not only simple physics and metaphysics, which, I'm not a physics major, but boy, I sure have learned an awful lot about how that works in a system. We also have to understand that there are simple principles in play that have really meaningful and very profoundly impacting influences on the decisions that we make. And I, over the years, have grown this into an area of teaching with program evaluation and ethical administrative practice that I find it works pretty well for a cross-disciplinary approach. The really important thing is that we all are working within a system. And there are a lot of influences, whether it's the opioid crisis or it's, economic decay or trade wars or just any one of 10,000 things. They are all exerting an influence on whatever system we find ourselves operating within. It's a lot like bubbles, soap bubbles, where you might have soap bubbles inside of soap bubbles, and they're all connected. And if one pops, that changes the characteristic and behavior of the entire group of bubbles. I think that's probably a simple but a good analogy for how fragile and vulnerable these systems are to a single event. So we can predict those behaviors, and we must learn how to think about how these systems are working in order for us to get a handle on this kind of national conversation. This work comes out of complexity theory, and there are far smarter people than I who developed this theory about how to manage systems. But complexity theory essentially says that we have problems. Problems are sub-elements of systems, and problems also have characteristics. They're simple, and they have starting and stopping points, or we have complex problems that are interrelated problems. That is, one problem and its actions and outcomes will affect other problems that are associated with the questions that we ask. So if we make a change in one area, we can reasonably expect that that change will exert an influence across other things that we may see or not see at the time that we are making our decisions.
Can you think of a practical example, like maybe something that you could contextualize in work that you've done previously?
Well, let me use an example that's in the national news this week, and that's the problem of the Kurds in Syria, where one simple action can destabilize a system with catastrophic results.
Yeah.
And, it's not a question of who shot John or whether, whether people are bad. It is that we have multiple problems operating within a systemic environment. And by making change in one of those elements, it can have tremendously positive effects, and we call that innovation, or it can have tremendously negative effects, which are catastrophic. And I've been really lucky in my life to have both of those experiences. So we probably all should have that at some point because they teach us. But I think that those issues are important. The conversation about opioids and drugs are bad or drugs are good or, whatever, is kind of representative of a third kind of problem, which is that of the wicked problem. And a wicked problem is one in which we have many, many problems and many interrelated touch points that make it difficult for us to get our arms around even identifying what the questions are that we should be asking when we're designing our solutions and desired outcomes.
This is maybe simplifying it a little bit, but the example that you just gave about our foreign policy blunders here, the outcome that was defined by Trump was that, well, I got the troops out of Syria, so if that's the outcome that we want, then that works, but that's a problem with framing, and I suppose that's somewhat what you're talking about. Luckily, people are wise enough to see past that one-dimensional desired outcome, but Yeah.
Some people are, but some people aren't. And that
Right.
takes us sort of to the next level of influence here. And that is, we are not all equally equipped to see the forest for the trees. And so, we all, each of us, live in a context. That context fuels and frames what we learn. So, and that is on top of our own developmental and cognitive capacities.
Right.
So, if you look at, I think that the one thing that we don't pay a lot of attention to is the fact that this universe of ours is three-dimensional and it has a very strong time element.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as we are working with desirable framing, we're trying to figure out what the questions are, how to frame the questions so that we can begin to develop goals and objectives for addressing activities that we want to apply to reach these desirable outcomes. We don't really understand, for a variety of reasons, all have an equal understanding of how to measure what we do, how to frame the question, how these contextual factors are working together in three dimensions over a period of time, and how do we account for the influence of not only time elements but innovation. What is innovation? We talk about innovation a lot, but innovation actually has very specific rules itself that we can apply to system elements. But we can't do it if we don't understand that these contextual systems have rules. And, I run my household against a set of rules, as I'm sure you do. It helps us to manage the things that we have coming at us.
Yeah.
The communities in which we live have laws, policies, regulations, work instructions, values, expectations, and so forth. Those kind of work together to manage that contextual system.
It's all under the auspices of the Constitution, which is a fluid and changeable document meant to correct for biases.
Well, I'm sure that our founding fathers didn't really understand that, but they got a lot of things right.
Yeah.
One of the things, however, that we need to pay attention to is the fact that to manage this opioid crisis and to manage any social problem, we have to understand the place that problem lives. We talk about all solutions being local, or the best solutions being local. That's true up to a point, but local systems still share behavioral characteristics.
Sure, yeah.
We have in this opioid crisis a lot of competing objectives. And what we have is a very complex government working at odds with state systems and community systems. And if we look at the national system as the context, then the states are sub-elements, and within those states, they all have their own community elements, all of which have their own specific behaviors depending on whether they're urban, rural, how much resources they have, the people who live inside those contextual elements, what their own expectations are, their own experience and their training. So those are not necessarily equal. And whether they balance themselves out has a lot to do with management of expectations for how that system is going to perform at some level, whether it's national or state or it's local. So that drives the framing of this national conversation.
We are going back and forth, probably often unwittingly, between a local and a national conversation and framing of the problem.
Continually. And I think that it's okay and it's not okay. The problem that we have in that going back and forth is that we have essentially a wicked problem, and that is we have lots and lots and lots of poorly designed interventions that we don't have rules or logical measures for in order to manage those interventions. So they add a lot of friction and drag on these systems. They consume a lot of energy and a lot of resources. And we don't know what their influence is, even though we know that they have an influence, because we haven't framed them properly.
Thanks for tuning in, folks. And remember, that's not the end of this talk. Part 2 of this 2-part discussion will be aired next week. Hope you enjoyed, and please stay tuned for more.